I think it would be fair to say that we have all become China experts in the last few years. We all think we know China and what China is doing, or at least some of us pretend. But I think we have a panel of very eminent China watchers today with us, because I think the topic itself deserves a bit of a closer scrutiny than perhaps we are doing either academically or think tank wise or even in the media, given the rapidity of change that we have seen in the last few years in particular, especially in the realm of Chinese economy. Actually, what is going on, we keep hearing a spate of, we keep getting a spate of data, recurring news items about Chinese economy not doing well. The news reports have suddenly turned very negative. The data that is coming out is telling us, is giving us a side of the picture that we are yet to fully incorporate in the way we look at the so-called China's rise and its implications. And I think especially if you look at the post-COVID phase, the initial expectation was that the Chinese economy would bounce back very quickly. And initially, of course, the first quarter, after the relaxation of the zero COVID strategy, we saw improvements in the data. But later on, I think the realization is that things have gone back to perhaps looking very bleak on the data front. And also the bigger issue, I think, that came out recently was the demographics issue. What is happening to the Chinese demographics, the whole productive labor force versus unproductive labor force. How will they interact? How will that impact the Chinese model of being the manufacturing center of the world? And in all of this, what is the space for countries like India, for countries in Asia and elsewhere, that have also been not been able to reap the full benefits of economic globalization? So sometimes when we are looking at the issue of de-risking, decoupling, we are also talking of greater distribution of advantages across the world and in geographies which perhaps have not benefited in the past. So to tackle some of these issues, I don't think we can tackle all of them in the hour or so that we have, but to tackle some of the issues in particular, taking a deep dive into what perhaps is happening within the Chinese economy and how that is implicating the rest of us. We have a group of very eminent people who have been observing China for a very long time and who can give us some insights and perhaps some more granular understanding of how we should understand Chinese economic trajectory today, what are its implications for us as well as for the region, and what are its implications for China itself that has been so critically at the center of global economy for such a long time. So I would open this floor. I would start with Aravind Aravind Yelery from JNU, who has in fact written about, talked about, and engaged with the subject of Chinese economy, and especially I think state-owned enterprises in particular. China. Aravind, I think we can perhaps start from a meta picture of what the Chinese data is telling us at the moment, and how should we interpret it as some of us who perhaps are not the China experts in the room.
Okay, thank you, Harsh, and thank you all for having me. The bigger picture, which looks in terms of Chinese economy, is a lot glimmer. For past 18 months, China was expecting that it will come back, and it will really perform better. First quarter, especially 2023, was a little bit promising, but if you look at the growth figures for Q2 and now cumulatively for H1, it gives you a picture that China is slowing down tremendously. Somewhere in next 5 years, these growth rate will come back to 4% or 3.7.5%. And if you put that in contrast with what China was performing, how China was performing in the last 45 years, that looks pretty shocking, because everything is stopping, halting, stalling. That is not what China used to. And there are basic fundamental differences and points one has to understand it. Why it is happening, why it is not that the Chinese leadership is trying to understand, and why they're not trying to tackle with it. Understand one thing: when China inherited a model of growth in 1978, further developed it, retouched it in 80s and again 1992, 96, 2000 forward. China was trying to do some band-aid or superficial adjustment to the economy. It was not structural changes they were trying to make in the economy. As a result of it, when we look at the demographic factor, well, now Harsh pointed out rightly that demography is a major challenge, a structural challenge, and Chinese will not be able to cope up with it, but just to face it. Now, can or not China do away or try to cope up with the structural problem? Look at Japan. Despite growing number of demographic uncertainties and imbalances, Japan could cope up with that. But why China is not doing that? Every year 10 million students graduate, 14 million students take up exams, 20 million people retire, and the retirement population is growing by a very good of 3 to 4%. Today China has 250 million retired population. And that the gap of 10 million, those who graduate and those who are retiring, is not able to, it's going to widen further. Now, more than that, if you look at Evergrande, now, what I believe is Evergrande was just one symptom. More than that, Evergrande has or revealed or exposed Chinese structural problem in a greater scale. For example, if you look the list of people who are party secretaries in all the provinces, municipalities, and autonomous regions, none of them is representing their own province. For example, a party secretary of Guangdong is coming from Anhui. A party secretary for Anhui is coming from Jiangxi. Jiangxi is coming from Jiangsu. So these people do not really understand that how local economy and local government should sustain, how they should find problems. So Evergrande is just one symptom of it. Today, the leadership are clueless. They do not know how to go forward and what are the ways they can come up, measures they can do away with this thing. For example, we talk about the debt issues, right? Local government debt issues. Mind it, the Chinese central government debt to GDP ratio is much, much better, even compared to Japan, compared to Korea. Why doesn't central government simply come forward and take that debt on their own book? Because there is a kind of skepticism among the central leadership to help the provincial leadership, because then these are things not everyone is talking aloud in the open. The problem in China, or structural problems, is not only economics. There is a deep-rooted political contest between regions, people, factions, narratives. And that's the reason why the Evergrande happened. Before Evergrande, Wanka had happened. Before Wanka, Wanta had happened. So it is not something that Evergrande happened within one night. That's number one. Second thing is Chinese leadership and Chinese provinces' economy was used to this autopilot mode post-78. Do exports, do exports, do exports. And then that exports would generate, employment, that exports would really give some kind of, heavy lifting to the property markets. And that's how that algorithm really worked. Very simple. E is equal to MC square. And now when pandemic happened, and before that, from 2007, things started looking so much jittery that Chinese leadership got clueless what to do with it. Now, let me relate it with one more problem over here. Since Chinese growth model was not their own growth model, but a growth model which was handpicked, adjusted, readjusted, banded type, what I said, superficial, it really did not know how to stop a problem, how to stop the buck. And that is where we see people are losing confidence. Now, I was reading one important story which was published in a local newspaper where a student was writing, I was in higher middle school when I was 13. And when it's 2013, Xi Jinping came to power. Today is 2023. I'm graduated. I'm young, 23 years old. I don't have a job. Unemployment rate is very high. If I'm earning, I cannot keep the money in the bank because the bank interest rates are low. It's very strange. The Chinese bank is lowering the interest rates to, infuse or increase the consumption. And then the youth is absolutely lost. So this is a larger picture. Demographic is structural problems. Local governments are not interested, solving it, talking to each other or talking to central government, and central government doesn't look like, it's going to come forward. Second important thing, what I would like to put on the table, which most of us think that, China wants to become number one economy. Yes, it wants to, but it is difficult because it is trapped in two ways. Number is the middle technology gap. Middle technology is a gap where you need a large amount of innovations to be applied by large scale of local enterprises. That is not happening. That convergence is failing. In the last year, 2022, if you talk about semiconductor industries, there are more than 3,600 enterprises failed in China in semiconductors industry only. That is the top value notch industry in the economy, and China wants to displace the other industries from Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, and US, right? It is not functioning. It is not functioning, it is not delivering. Second trap is a middle income trap. Now, we all know that China is trying to look at a per capita income of $23,000, right? Everybody forgets that China also holds or also has 650 million people whose monthly salary is below $300. Look at the gap. And this is a major problem China has to tackle. And then post-pandemic, this thing starts, unfolding. Structural changes, structural adjustments, and Chinese regulators in most of the cases are clueless. For example, there have been cases and reports and protests in rural China about the way the banks are, asking them to deposit money and not giving them the returns which they're promising because the interest rates are fluctuating every quarter. That means the consumer confidence in the bank's investments is fluctuating, is becoming more volatile, as well as the consumers are not ready to spend. How on earth Chinese government, is thinking that, the young population should go out in the market and spend their savings? Impossible. That is not really going to happen. Post-pandemic, the rate of household savings has gone up. From 78 onwards, it is only last 18 months the first time it has happened that the household savings has gone up phenomenally vis-a-vis the consumption rate. And this is not looking very promising. Now, one last point, I think, before I just let other panelists put their points, is what is the role of foreign enterprises? Because foreign investment is steeply falling. The trust in Chinese market is dropping every day because of Xi Jinping's policies to control auditing, to control market investigations. Nobody, no consultants, including the top PwC, McKinsey, Deloitte, are not ready to come to China. If these are not coming to China, how come they expect the foreign enterprises will come? But shockingly, there are few cities, for example, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, have staggering amount of foreign investments coming in, but in limited numbers. For example, I'll give you a recent data which says that only in Shanghai, there are 90,000 enterprises, Chinese enterprises, which have foreign investments. So China is not interested decoupling from the West. China is hedging. China is standing on a slippery slope. Don't forget it, China has about 700 billion of tradable, chances with the United States, and it doesn't want it to just disappear. The recent example of, the banning of rare earth materials, I think that, China would not make that mistake of banning it entirely. China is trying to hedge, and China is trying to, balance on those things. So these are just initial points to take forward. Josh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a big picture examination of some of the big trends. Since you raised this issue of provinces and differences, I'll bring Professor Agarwal, if you can engage with this subject, because this is, I think, your primary area of expertise. are we when we look at China, most of us look at these meta trends and we understand them, in a very generic sense. Are there provincial differences that we are looking at, which are important for us to understand? Of course, you can add anything to what Aravind has already said, but I would also like you to take us a bit deeper into the Chinese economy in terms of the framework of provinces versus the center, that debate as well.
Thank you, Professor Harsh. Now, actually, I was thinking, how to begin, because there were a lot of headlines against going on in various newspapers. One says that local government debt, which seems to be a very alarming rate, seems to be almost reaching to 35 trillion yuan. So that is a one story which is going around in almost all the newspapers. Second, which I found very interesting to also look at, most of the infrastructure development programs, like theme park, metro stations, highways, high-speed trains, or for that matter, even the various housing projects remain incompleted. So there is no capital can be pumped into that, and which requires a lot of massive debt repayments required by the company. So Evergrande is one example, and is happening in other places also. Third is, as I said, the huge transport infrastructure plan. So most of the provinces have connectivity issues, highways, expressways, metro trains, or transit, or other kind of a thing. Then other interesting news, which is again becoming a lot of kind of a very important kind of sensation, is that the commercial spaces getting vacated, especially in the provinces like Guangdong. So Guangdong is considered to be one of the very important powerhouse kind of a province, and where you have most of the commercial spaces are getting vacated. So which means that cooling of the business activity. So these 3-4 news events created a lot of sensation in the last few, as I was reading, months and days, and kind of a thing. And then, so on the one hand, you have the mega projects, which Chinese have been very much obsessed with. So somewhere, the idea of a excessive capital investment or excessive infrastructure development, something which we are actually witnessing from the, sorry to bring, greatly forward time. Everything seems to be in excess. So that seems to be very much prevalent even in the infrastructure development which Chinese have been engaged in. So whether you talk about mega projects like big towers, or you're talking about the housing projects all over China. So that created a kind of a need for China to get into kind of a loan. And in that case, the local government have devised this idea of a local government financial vehicles. So something which has been called, which is basically a part of a local government. And how do they work, and in the sense how these are established? These are basically established through the allocation of land. So other reports which were actually also very much popular was that most of the local government fiscal revenue comes from the land sale. So earlier the model was that you transfer the rural land to urban land, and on that you have the commercial projects, and through which you have a kind of a lot of revenue generation. But that model has in a way changed now. So you have this kind of a what I call it as a debt financing, in the sense who finance this local government debt. So for that, this local government financial vehicles which have been established by the local government, they have this allocation of land, equity share, fees, national bonds, which actually necessitate the flow of cash, and which actually finance all these infrastructure projects as such. Now, there's something called Changtao bonds, which is called as a urban construction and the investment bonds, and which use this land rights as a kind of a collateral, kind of property where they can use it. Now, what happens? Some of the reports says that land sale revenue actually constitute almost 80% of the fiscal revenue of the provinces. However, as I'm saying, slowly you will see most of these real estate projects, which was a part of the various provincial development strategy, have remained incompleted or remained suspended. As a result, some of the, of course, the prosperous provinces may be still able to get some kind of a share, through the fiscal expenditure. I'll come to it in a while. But some of the, the poorer provinces like Yunnan, Guizhou, and the not so developed provinces, their debt almost reached to almost 100%. So this is a kind of a ratio of the debt. And also because they have been given the responsibility of invest. After 1995 tax reforms, they have been given the responsibility of investing in a other kind of a social service projects as well. For example, public health, or hospitals, or educational institutions, or other kind of a social service. So that kind of expenditure responsibility was also given to the local government after the tax reform. So I'll come to that in a while. So what are the local government debt? I mean, how do you categorize it? Basically the debt which is basically held by the local government for public services, that is one component of it. Then all the losses which is incurred by the local government owned companies, that is also part of it, and the huge salaries they have to pay. Suppose some of the provinces have a huge, the network of they hired a lot of officials for various kind of departments, bureaus, agencies, which requires a huge amount of salaries need to be paid, and that also kind of become a huge debt or burden on the provincial government. And of course, I told you about the agriculture, environmental projects. That's the other kind of Now, what are these local government financial vehicles which I've been talking about? So these are fully owned by the local government. Some are listed on the stock exchange as well. And local government use land transfer revenue to make them to work as a kind of a guarantees. And the responsibility of repaying these loans also depend on the local government. But what is happening in the last few years, though they are able to transfer the land sale revenue to that, but they are not able to repay all that. So what is happening? To repay those loans, they are actually borrowing more loans. So it is like accumulating over the years. Now let me come back to this. So how do this debt financing take place? So local government, why I call it debt financing, because it's no longer a kind of an investment. It's a financing which is happening through the various banks, then local government, then this kind of SOEs and the financial vehicles. So capital circulates in all this and then keeps getting injected into the infrastructure development purposes. But what is happening in the last few years, that especially after the pandemic, and even I would say it began when even Xi Jinping took over that time, but it may not be of that scale. But now the scale is quite quite high. So all these highways, bridges, whatever Chinese provinces are engaged in, they become a kind of assets to be put as a kind of a collateral property for this kind of a local government financial vehicles. And then they raise funding through bank loans or the trust products or the leases. So basically the idea is that the capital was injected through these various models of financial vehicles by the local government to finance all this infrastructure capital. But looks like that model is also not working now. So what is a new to be adopted? So there was a kind of a complete turnaround. So model of urban development, where you have the agricultural land was changed into converted into kind of a commercial land, or the land for the urban development purposes. And now you have a little larger scale, where you have the capital being circulated along all this kind of financial vehicles and various mechanism, but it is not able to produce so much of the results as such. The money has not been coming back to the government as such. So they are not able to repay the loans. Most of the defaults are happening in this situation. So therefore, what you see, if it is a kind of economy is growing, so all these things keep circulating, keep moving. But now, since there is a kind of as it is, there's a slum, and there's also a kind of crisis, as well as economic slowdown. So all these are not able to generate profit, and as a result, what you see is a kind of ghost towns, which is becoming too much of important problem for many provinces also to sell their property, as well as the people who are not able to buy those properties, because sometimes they think the prices are too high or the interest is too high. So there was a report I remember a few months back that how people in certain areas refuse to pay interest on the property they bought. So there was a kind of clear idea that it is too high, so there need to be kind of a crackdown on this. Sorry. And then there's a kind of two kind of a debt. One is explicit debt, one is implicit debt. So there's a hidden debt. So now explicit debt, we know what is a kind of a real figure, which is basically on the record on budget liabilities. But there's a hidden debt also where we don't know the correct clear picture in the sense how much is. So it's not been recognized by the central government. Now, in this debt quotas as well, some of the prosperous provinces, because suppose you look at the Central Politburo Standing Committee, and as well as the Politburo members, some of the provincial party secretaries are also the members of the Politburo Standing Committee and otherwise. So they are able to bargain for more debt quotas as well as a more issuance of the bonds or some kind of a flexibility in terms of fiscal transfer. But the problem happens with the kind of a not so rich and prosperous and developed regions because they are not able to bargain for this kind of a fiscal transfer from the central government. So the problem is more for them. And therefore, the debt ratio is almost going to be 100% in this kind of a underdeveloped provinces. So which means that the provinces, rich and poor, which actually Chinese government was trying to address those differences through various kind of a campaign, Western Region Development Program, or other kind of a preferential policies, seems to be coming back again, because somewhere these bargaining practices they are not able to complete because of the provincial leaders are not there in the Politburo. Now, quickly, I just tell you about the tax reform. So as I was saying, that is basically after 1994, the local government was basically asked to generate fiscal income, and expenditure was basically remain in the sense decentralized. What I mean to say is that the income has to be given, basically the budgetary income has to be distributed almost 50-50% between the center and the localities, or somewhere it was 60-40%. But the non-budgetary income, where the local government has a kind of a complete autonomy to generate revenues or to increase revenue. So that is where you will see the whole kind of a land sale, land revenue, as well as other kind of infrastructure projects started coming up in those areas, because that is where they can make money in. So non-budgetary kind of income, which was left to the local government, and that is where you will see from 2000 onwards, there was a kind of a huge expenditure pressure because the quotas were fixed by the central government to local government. So this is kind of a targets, and why these targets you have to fulfill? Because the performance-based promotions of the provincial leaders depending on how much targets and how much quotas they are about. They are able to fix it. So therefore, you will see pressure on the local government that where they have to fulfill those targets which are set by the central government. And they have launched various kind of projects in construction, rural development, infrastructure, etc., which need to be completely been taken care of. So as I always told you, that this comes under the kind of a extra budgetary income where the central government has no control over it. And that is where they try to sell the land, which also now seems to be a problem, because as I'm saying, that earlier through land revenue, they could actually kind of obtain some kind of income. But now, since a lot of housing projects are actually left unoccupied, and there's again a kind of a spree of ghost towns which is increasing in China, where there's a kind of no occupancy. So in this situation, I don't know how much this land sale also will be able to give them revenue generation for this kind of a provincial government. Quickly. As I also indicated, that some of the provinces which are prosperous, they could actually take a lot of freedom in terms of issuance of this investment bonds. But this kind of bonds were not given to the the not so prosperous regions, because they thought they will not be able to pay. So again, there's a kind of a you can say the differences which happens in the regions wise. Yeah. So now many companies which also invested in this kind of urban infrastructure projects, for example, these SOEs, local SOEs, they also seems to be running into losses. So in that case, whether the provincial government will be coming forward to pay for this kind of a defaulters. So in most of the cases, especially in Hainan and Yunnan, I mean, we have two examples where the entire local economy seems to be in chaos, where all these companies or SOEs were not able to repay the debt which was on them. So which means it is now the responsibility of the local government Now, the whole thing is that how to generate revenues and how to generate income for that. So the cash constraint becomes a major problem for the local SOEs as well. And as I said that, this brings back, the whole issue is that how much land sale can bring now the problem is that how much land sale can bring the revenue generation for this provincial government, and what about the other kind of taxes? For example, suppose we talk about taxes. In case of provinces in China as well as local other places in China, entertainment, restaurants, shopping, malls, consumption. So all these actually have been supposed to be pay the taxes to the government. So unlike India, where many things have been sold out by various shops, etc., without generating any kind of bills. Well, in case of China, you don't see those kind of problems. So restaurants, hotels, and all kind of shopping areas, as well as all that which is available where you actually malls, etc., where everything has been credited for. So in this situation, land sale may not be the 50% of the revenue. Rather, you have to increase the consumption in other sense as well. Then the whole issue is that whether households can afford to do that as well. Because as everybody is saying that, there's a wide differences which is happening in terms of income. So I think these are the issues which, I wanted to raise.
Thanks, Professor Agarwal. I think we have had two versions of the challenges, internal challenges China is facing. A very sort of a narrative from when we look at the meta trends, how do we identify them? And I think more of a at the provincial level, and I think one interesting point that Ritu made was about the political intent behind economic decision making. How that I think creates constraints for Chinese policy making as move forward. When the going is good, it's always easy. When the going gets tough, I think that kind of decision making creates its own sets of disincentives. Gaurie, who is a senior editor with Economic Times, perhaps, and your very famous book that you wrote largely was focused on the external dynamic of China's engagement with the rest of the world. When we have heard these two very expansive accounts of the challenges that China is facing, and please feel free to add to that if you wish. But we would also like you to expand a bit on what impact that is having on Chinese thinking about its global outreach, global policies, economic coercion, for example, something that you have written about. Are we looking at a shift in that context, that now that we are on an economic back foot, perhaps we need to reassess this, or is it doubling down on that? So what is your assessment in that domestic and global context?
Thank you for that. And yes, there's been a very exhaustive overview of the Chinese economic system by both Aravind and Ritu, which really explains or partly explains why the economic decision making is not keeping pace with the dynamics of the economy right now. And this has very deep impact on how China is going to engage with the rest of the world. What happens to its flagship project, BRI? Take any estimate, even if you take them with a bucket of salt, at least about $800 billion to $1.1 trillion is the kind of money that China has invested in BRI. What happens to those investments going forward? If the economy domestically is not doing well, then there are very high chances that it will not be able to pump in that kind of money going forward. But these are not economic projects. These have deep geopolitical importance and are very closely linked to Xi Jinping's legacy. So to that effect, how will they shape up, or how will they redefine themselves going forward? And also what happens to corridors like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? The kind of problems it's facing, the kind of changes that are likely to happen in it, I think would be the big focus areas for the CCP as well for the next 12 to 18 months, because they can't jettison this project altogether, but they need to realign to the latest ground realities as they are. Some of the latest data estimates, I put a caveat here, BRI, there are no standardized estimates that are available. You take AEI estimates, you take any, there's enough and more variation that's there. Having said that, the trend lines are pretty much the same. which is that low-income countries owe 37% of their debt to China. In contrast, they owe less than 25%, less than a quarter of their debt to the rest of the world. So that's the kind of debt that some of these low-income countries with poor asset qualities have to China. One example I'll take is that of Bangladesh, which has 6% of its total foreign debt to China, upwards of $4 billion, at a time when it is already seeking an IMF bailout for about $4.5 billion. Why does this impact us? And why is it that it is so important to discuss this when we talk about the Chinese economy? Because China cannot roll over these debts. China will have to ask for payments to be made, even if there are IMF bailouts that have to be made by India's neighbors. Pakistan is already going through it. Sri Lanka will see some form of it. Likewise, Bangladesh. As I said, these figures are worrying for India. Now, the other aspect that I want to say is that the project finance that the BRI hallmark of BRI is, project finance is inherently disadvantageous to all BRI recipient countries. Upwards of 6.2% is the average interest for long-term project finance on BRI recipient nations. This is atrociously high, given that for multilateral engagements, it is sub 0.5%. Second is the duration of the BRI loans. It is on average 10 years. 10 years is nothing when you're talking about long-term project finance. It's 30 years or 40 years when you take multilateral engagements. Now, in the backdrop of this precarious finances, the Chinese government or Mr. Xi Jinping is making changes to the broad framework of BRI, or at least that's what the data seem to indicate. The average size of deals have fallen in the last 1 year. Average financing for construction projects has also fallen. They realize they can't fund those big ticket white elephant projects anymore, but that doesn't mean they'll stop funding. They will fund, but they will fund where it makes sense. Quoting just one estimate, which is that of Fudan University itself, which says that the deal size has gone down from $617 million in 2022 to $392 million. A massive 40% cut has happened in the average deal size. China is reassessing BRI in the wake of its economic frailties that it's seeing domestically. But what it is now doing is it is investing in metals and minerals. Like the lithium mines that everybody has talked about and seen in the past, it's now about the cobalt and nickel mines. And the top 5 countries are now Bolivia, Tanzania, Namibia, Eritrea. Nowhere does Pakistan figure in all of this. Nowhere does Sri Lanka figure in all of this. Nowhere does Europe figure in all of this. It is Latin America and Africa. So that is the realignment that BRI itself is now going to see in the wake of the changes that the Chinese economy is witnessing. But I must spend a minute in the spirit of keeping this short so that more questions can also be taken. I must talk about how, when you talk about external economic engagement, I think Pakistan is very important for us to understand, and how CPEC is changing is very important for us to understand. Just one example I will give, which is that while it was hailed as the big economic elixir, so to say, for all problems of Pakistan, how it has dampened the economic realities of Pakistanis. Just 2 things. One is that the ML1 line, which was the main Karachi-Peshawar line, has been scrapped. And that is now something that the Pakistani government will have to take. This is symptomatic of how China will deal with BRI in larger context, which is even the slightest bit of unviability will mean that the project will have to be taken by the recipient nations themselves, adding to their debt woes. Second is that now that major power grids have been taken over by China and Pakistan, 110% is the kind of increase in electricity bills that Pakistanis have seen in the last 14 months alone. Again, symptomatic of how the entire projects or corridors will be reevaluated by China going forward. I'm going to pause here so that we can get more questions and we can cover more ground.
Thank you. I think useful, and I think it takes us into the trajectory that we have been following in terms of this conversation in particular. Let me invite Kalpit, who is from ORF and who tracks China for us, to talk a bit, briefly on this question of, because we have looked at China at the moment. We have looked at both economic domestic challenges as well as what impact it has on China's foreign policy or external engagement, especially in the economic domain, as Gaurie pointed out. But I think it would be useful for us to culminate this part of our conversation by discussing this whole thing about de-risking, decoupling that has now been, we are talking of it as de-risking. How is that panning out in terms of Chinese own thinking? Where are they in terms of assessing? Are they optimistic that they will be able to weather this storm, and that the fact that the world is now not talking of decoupling and moving towards de-risking, do they see this as a vindication of Chinese in continuing to be this very, very central actor in the global economy, or the Chinese realize that the long-term trends are very clear, where the West and the rest of the world is going to be very difficult for them to manage? So give us a sense of the domestic debate on China on this very critical issue that we have been talking a lot in terms of the rest of the world versus China.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Pant. I think when we talk about this entire debate about decoupling and de-risking, of course, the West talks about it in terms of like there are two different separate concepts. But for China, the Chinese narrative about this is that there's not really any difference between decoupling and de-risking. It says that it's not like de-risking is a notch less than decoupling, but the whole idea is that a technology blockade against China is aimed at our economy, I mean China's economy, and by creating disgruntlement among people, the West hopes to basically effect a regime change. So that is one of the key arguments of China, at least in domestically. And China, the Communist Party is extremely worried about this because if you see the number of references that are being made to decoupling and de-risking on a daily basis in the state-owned media, it is it has gone up phenomenally since the entire start of the debates regarding decoupling and de-risking. Again, the National Security Commission of China talks about the fact that the Chinese economy faces a very, very difficult situation in terms of its national security. Why? Because it says that China needs to prepare for the worst case scenario. Now, what is this so-called risk that it is facing? It is saying that this whole trend of trade protection and the politicization of security chains is going to impact us in a very big way. Now, again, coming to the the broad Chinese response to it is there is a great pushback diplomatically. So here, China has tried to play the race or the nationalism card, however you look at it. So one of the commentaries in the by a party scholar, by the Communist Party as a think tank. So one of the commentaries that came out is that de-risking, decoupling is actually a path to de-Sinicization. That this is really the West or the US looks at Asia most like a place where you can get your cheap labor and you can have your you can dump your products. So this is how this is how it is being constructed. And also, it was okay for Asia. It was okay for nations like China to assemble washing machines and microwave ovens. But when we have an aspiration to achieve something higher, we have an aspiration for something like to achieve breakthroughs in innovation. That's when the West is trying to stymie us. So that when they talk about us, it's also like when Wang Yi met South Korean and Japanese diplomats recently, he makes this point again. He says that I think, you all are with the, this is the wrong side of history, that, we have differences, but let's try to sort it amongst ourselves. So there's a very strong race card to it. The other way in which, in fact, Wang Yi makes this point that, by siding with the whites, you're not going to become white, but, you should be siding with, our race. So there's a very, a very racial connotation to it. The other is, there is a kind of a fight back. There is a message of a fight back in the Chinese system where, there are authors like Pai Ming. Now, Pai Ming is a scholar who works with the Chinese Commerce Ministry. Now, Pai Ming talks about the fact that China has to make a big splash in new markets. So, in this regard, the Honduran model has been, greatly discussed in China. Now, Honduras, after it switched allegiances from Taiwan to China. It was included in the BRI. The president of Honduras, Xiomara Castro, had a state visit to China, in which this was used as a big kind of a propaganda coup, because she visited the New Development Bank. She also visited the a research and development facility of Huawei. And to top it, there was this entire thing where she said that this entire propaganda against BRI being a debt trap is a Western plot. So this is how. So this is one way in which China is trying to counter this entire narrative. Yeah.
Thanks, Kalpit. Before we open this up, for your questions, comments, and observations, I'll just get one more round of interventions. Aravind, we have talked about it economically, in an economic sense. Can we now relate it to the political economy is this primarily an issue, or is this economic deceleration? Can we look at it through the prism of Xi Jinping's way of decision making? Because we are seeing an array of decisions that have not gone right for China. And of course, we have always talked about in conceptual terms, look, there is lack of transparency, system is centralized, centralized systems do not yield, often optimum results. But when you look at some almost a trend can be established in terms of what we would call bad decisions, right? Suboptimal outcomes. COVID's management, later on the way certain things have been handled. We have had some recent decisions as well about Chinese foreign minister disappearing, about the way they have restructured their rocket force, etc. I mean, there are a host of issues which are linked to the way decisions are being made. So can we understand the economy of course, political economy of China has always been very intricately linked. But are we looking at this Xi Jinping model of development, of Xi Jinping model of decision making, also having an impact on the way perhaps China is trying to struggle with its economic problems?
Yes, there is certain interesting stories actually. 2007, when Xi Jinping was given the duty of vice president and was given extra responsibilities to commemorate the China's opening up. The China was recording 2007, 14% of growth. Okay, and from there, that was actually Xi Jinping's rise. So from 2007 onwards until now, 14% down to 5%. That has left a really, a bitter experience as far as Xi Jinping is concerned. But why it has not helped Xi Jinping to reinvent the wheel, and then why he kept on making, I should not say mistakes, but he failed to read the challenges and rectify them. There's one major thing is Xi Jinping is obsessed with his own way of state crafting China's rise internally and externally. And he has been not able to read the thin difference between what China did in 1978 and what he's doing is exactly opposite. What Deng Xiaoping was doing is trying to relate the ideology, party's legacy with the growth. But what he's exactly doing is actually he's putting part legacy first, and then the growth is secondary. And why I say so, because if you see, the important thing China talks, Xi Jinping talked about rejuvenation, Chinese dream, but on the other hand, he was talked about dealing with factionalism. He talking about COVID and very strict policies. He talked about different levels of shunning the Chinese companies cooperating with the Western companies. That is more inward-looking invention schemes or innovation schemes. He forgot that opening up helps China to build better. I had a very strong feeling since I was a student. I started observing China. 2007, I landed in China, and then Hu Jintao was introducing these land reforms. Since then, Xi Jinping came to power, he thought that China has lost the lot of momentum. Hu Jintao's period in Chinese history and in literature officially is known as lost years. So he came back. He is the only one last leadership who is a product of revolution. So he has this very unique combination and narratives built in his mind that he has to take things in control. Ideology has to be on the forefront. He has to take things very rebellious way, which nobody else could thought of. One more thing, I make this statement always when Henry Paulson met Xi Jinping in the guest house of Churchiang. Xi Jinping was still able to laugh, but actually he lost entire laugh because he was so much under tremendous pressure. You don't see the same Xi Jinping he was ruling in Fujian, in Zhejiang, and in Ningde. This is a different Xi Jinping. He's obsessed with making Chinese state stronger internally and putting that, as a face value or earning more force value externally. So this has created a lot of contradictions which Xi Jinping keeps forgetting. It's a major problem. Because you see, when he talks about innovation and when he literally cracked on privatization, that was the last nail. He should have done that. He shouldn't have controlled the privatization, because if you see, a lot of literature has come out by Peter Nolan or by Nicholas Lodi from Peters Institute, that privatization was actually helping China to fill that void and get into the different stratosphere. And Xi Jinping did not read that. He made several mistakes. He misunderstood what is socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that, I think, was the first mistake. Second mistake, what Xi Jinping keeps making is not really boosting the confidence among the enterprises. If you look at the Chinese enterprises are growing. Their number is shrinking now. There's now 96. It has come down heavily. But the Chinese enterprises are not motivated anymore. Chinese enterprises do not see new sectors to innovate. What Chinese sectors are doing, they're just copying what Xi Jinping is doing politically. Chinese enterprises are buying small enterprises. They're trying to force universities, laboratories to do what they want to do. They're trying to force these state enterprises in the provinces, and then the provinces are again running out of money. So what Xi Jinping is doing politically, state enterprises are doing economically, internally. Now, third important thing, what the Chinese have been failing to gauge or to check the nerves of Chinese economy is what common Chinese want. They do not want infrastructure. If you go and look at the overcapacities has been built, forget about last 45 years. Let me put on the table last 10 years. How much of overcapacity has been built only during the period of Xi Jinping? Mammoth. And Xi Jinping has gone to only few provinces, 4 provinces. Why didn't he get time to go to Guangxi? Why didn't he go to Henan? Why didn't he go to Guangxi? Why didn't he go to other provinces? He's a very selected. He's supporting select provinces, select sectors. Now, if we say that Xi Jinping was in Zhejiang, and Zhejiang also has been hit by the local debt. He was party secretary there. How can he forget that he was party secretary there in Fujian also? And then when they become central leadership, they try to self-serve their motives. They're not understanding where the provinces are failing. So this is a major problem in China at 3 different levels, and these contradictions are just multiplying. A house in China is 40 times more than a median salary. A common Chinese cannot afford it. I'm definitely sure Xi Jinping knows this thing. But he's obsessed with that, controlling at every level. And he has been imitated by the enterprises. He has been imitated by his followers. And that is not going to help China. So what is the way forward? I'm saying China is going to shrink down further. There was a time when China was growing 14%. China was doubling its GDP every 5 years. Now the growth has come down to 5%. That means it will take 20 years. We are just 12 years away from 2035 goal of CCP, right? And we are just 24 years away from 2047 goals. And now keep these numbers in your mind. 5%, 2017, 14%. Every year, 5% GDP is increasing by 5%, and it is slowing down. That means that China, the aim of Xi Jinping to achieve something 2035, 2047 is going to become a test match. And Xi Jinping is going to get a lot of problem with this thing. I say it in a very lighter vein. Xi Jinping is playing hockey in a zero gravity. It's a problem for him. He has to come down and look and take a relook at problems. And why not, actually? He is a supreme leader. If he takes one step back, there is already a proverb written by Mao Zedong, right? 2 steps back to take 1 leap ahead. Why he's scared of why he's scared of only one line of answer? Xi Jinping is extremely insecure. And when somebody is insecure, he tries to find ways, make stories, write narratives, and make his people dream every day, twice on the weekends.
Briefly, if you can touch upon this issue at the provincial level as well, it's how is this manifesting itself between the center and the provinces?
Well, if you look at the leadership, I would say in case of during Hu Jintao time, since we are discussing, the Chinese model of development during Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, there was a certain level of decentralization where lot of freedom has been given to the provinces for income generation projects, revenues, etc. Now that somewhere I would say has led to a kind of a corruption. So for my understanding, Hu Jintao was actually in a way a kind of a liberal regime where a lot of policy innovations were done. If you talk about Aravind was talking about rural development, so you have this, socialist countryside where for the first time he raised the issue of 3 peasant problems: agriculture, rural countryside, and peasantry. So in a way, he was giving a lot of policy innovations both at the urban and the rural level, and somewhere that led to a kind of a corruption. So Poshilai case, so when Xi Jinping took over, Poshilai case was already in there, in the picture. So the whole idea was that, the Xi Jinping actually inherited a regime of burden, I would say. Burden of financial difficulties, burden of corruption, and the whole sort of institutions which were developed over the decades and years and generations for last 30 to 40 years. So he could not immediately change it as well. And the problem would have continued, I think, for some more time had he was not given the task of cleaning up the party, because the whole issue of loyalty, because somewhere the party also realized that especially at the local level, where they are losing kind of a connection as well as the kind of obedience and loyalty which they could not seem to be promised by the local provincial government. So Poshilai was one example where he was trying to become more powerful. there's something which they did not accept the provincial party secretary. So these kind of incidents were happening quite a lot, where they were not able to ensure a kind of a loyalty from the provincial level leaders, and therefore the whole issue was decentralization. So the idea was, where Hu Jintao time there was a certain level of decentralization, and then Xi Jinping came with this idea of a decentralization where they are now, they are actually in a way, they don't know, because this Xiong'an, for example, was a one important urban model for Xi Jinping, where he wanted to make a kind of a new city near Beijing. And the whole idea was that let's make Beijing only a political capital, and other kind of services should be transferred to Xiong'an. So this Beijing Tianjin Hebei, or this Yangtze River Delta, or this Hong Kong Bay Area. So all these were a kind of a urban cluster model which they were trying to bring, so that the new kind of a China can be built based on the urban mega cities kind of a thing. But that seems to be now, because of this provincial debt which is increasing in a huge number, as well as they are not able to tackle it, because they are not able to invest and inject the capital, because the capital was circulating when there was a housing construction was going on, people were able to buy it, as well as the highways, etc. So there was a certain channels of taxes which was going on smoothly so far. But now looks like there's an overcapacity. As I was saying, if you look at the provinces, they are all busy in connecting. So all over China, you can go within 2 hours from here to there. So I mean, for example, I don't understand why there was a need for making a kind of a high-speed train from Kunming to Beijing. I don't know how much of the passengers are traveling on a daily basis. So like this, there are various infrastructure kind of projects which are left unused, or they're not able to bring so much of a profit back to the government. So that is why now it is showing up in a big number. So again, there's a question mark, because Xiong'an doesn't seem to be catching up now, in the sense they don't know how to inject capital, though he has been visiting that area. And other projects also doesn't seem to be giving so much of returns. Land sale, again the value is coming down. Now what are they doing? They are actually encouraging people to remove restrictions. For example, earlier there was a hukou restrictions, or there was a restriction to purchase property. So all those are now, they are slowly loosening up, so that people can be motivated to buy, if not the first-hand houses, the second-rate housing. But that is also looks like is not happening in the 2-tier and the 3rd-tier cities. Of course, first-tier cities may be better off. So these are complete, huge challenges before the Xi Jinping regime now, in the sense that how to bring back the kind of a trust as well as credibility for the political regime, which is now not able to deliver back. So the idea of prosperity, which people have already talked about, consumption level, people have lots of income. So I think so far Xi Jinping was able to create a kind of credibility because of this prosperity promises. People have income. They could invest. Even the elite now are running away from China in a big number. So that's actually indicates a kind of a, I would say, regime challenges for China now. And where you have some how many provinces? Of course, they include Taiwan also as a part of province. But otherwise, provinces looks like is going through a huge debt, which seems to be unresolved. And if the local economy is not functioning fine, then how will they contribute to the central government fiscal expenditure? So that remained a kind of a major problem for the government to handle.
Thanks. Gaurie, very briefly, when you look at, there has been some amount of, as you were discussing earlier with Kalpit, from decoupling to de-risking, some reaching out from the US as well, some high-level visits. What do you see behind the intent behind this? Is it now about just managing China at the moment with the long-term strategy continuing to be making it difficult for China to participate in the global technology environment? Or are we looking at a kind of a rapprochement that, Henry Kissinger was there, very warmly welcomed. Aravind was saying that Xi Jinping hardly laughs. He was laughing that day very heartily, welcoming Kissinger. So do you see that? Do you see that partly, I think, unrelated to what the underlying trends are? Or is it something that you should be careful about in terms of the broader great power rapprochement that always tends to happen and surprise often the smaller states?
I think that's the other side of when we engage with China, which is that where do we find that balance between trade realities and also the fact that there is greater competition with regard to technology as well as the geopolitical realities. And I think that's the fine balance that America as well as India is trying to achieve, which is that we want to de-risk, but we cannot decouple completely. And America also realizes it. And I think the larger debate that is on is that which are the sectors where we want to coexist, co-partner, and co-thrive, so to say, with China, and which are those areas where we cannot. And I say we, I'm talking about countries, how they cannot expect China to take the leap. And I think technology is one of those areas. There is a lot of effort right now to ensure that China does not get access to the kind of technology that America has so far possessed, or some of the developing countries have possessed, whether it's AI, whether it's robotics, whether it's semiconductors. There is now a concerted effort, and I feel that's going to build up going forward. And the corollary of that is going to probably be India getting more aligned in that technology value chain. So far, we're of course we are perceived as the software labor arbitrage, so to say. But my sense is that if this coordination and this greater connect between, for the Quad countries comes together, and the trade realities keeping in mind, I think software and high-end technology is one area where India will probably partner more with America, whether it will be in terms of tech transfer, whether it will be in terms of, allowing India to get on to the semiconductor value chain, remains to be seen, because there have to be enabling factors as well in India. We've been talking about semiconductors since 2005. That was my first assignment as a journalist. Dayanidhi Maran spoke about it. We are in 2023. We're still talking about a semiconductor.
We're getting there.
Yeah. Only solace is China hasn't got there either. So that's the only solace. So, but what I see is that technology will be one area where China will be isolated more. The whole Netherlands, US, Japan initiative is taking up. And I believe sooner or later, India will probably become a partner in that. How big a role India will play, I think, is something that we're still some time away from figuring out.
Very briefly, in terms of the earlier question about de-risking and decoupling, and you mentioned the debate within China, where does India figure in this debate, if at all? I mean, is India talked about in this as part of this conversation in China? That look, that of course our strategic ties are not going well, but economic ties, as Gaurie mentioned, we can't really decouple. So is India part of that debate discussion within China as to what needs to be done, or is it something that is still primarily focused largely on the West?
See, there is one part of it that there is a lot of heartburn in China today that the Indian economy is doing well, and there are clouds of uncertainty over China. But having said that, the Chinese narrative on these things is very, very inward looking. So China is looking at what can Professor Yelery spoke about China being hedging. Now, there is also a notion in China that, capital, Western capital, Western technology, and the resultant human capital formation was responsible for China's success. Now, there is a narrative in China that says that fine, let countries like India, let them if they have to, let them rise. But what can we do internally? So China is looking at replicating things like human capital formation by investing more into the education sector. It's talking about there was this very nice paper by the president of Peking University, who says that I think we need a workforce that fulfills China's strategic needs in terms of science. So how about the private sector invest in science? How about the private sector invest in technology as far as enthusing youngsters to take up science in future? So this is one of the narratives that is currently going on in China.
Okay, let me open this up for your questions, comments, observations. Please introduce yourselves and direct the question at whosoever you want.
Hello, sir. I am Manisha. I am doing PhD in Chinese studies from JNU. And my question is from Ritu Agarwal, ma'am. Ma'am, you are saying that re-centralization is started. I want to know reason behind it. Why? matlab, is it that because of they are not able to ensure loyalty towards the central government, like provincial leaders, or no, or is it reason like corruption? But according to what is the reason behind loyalty or corruption?
I'm Manish Sharma. My basic question is regarding this, that we are seeing that the global demand is rising and the oil prices are also reaching above $90. So basically, are we seeing that the China factor is going to play a very important role as far as the global demand is concerned? And secondly, they are signing agreements, for example, very major agreements, for example, like RCEP, etc., and which are basically just to substitute this BRI, and so that they can import a lot of components, so that they can do away with the trade tariffs, etc., and so that they can generate fresh demand out of all this, tech war, etc., which they are having with the US, etc. So how do you see all that? Because in future we are seeing that multilaterally also we are seeing that countries are not now going to World Bank or IMF for finances. They are going to China. Recently they came up with a new development bank, and all of these finances are quite opaque at some level. So how do you see this narrative building up? Because China is going to play, according to some perception, is going to play a very dominant role in all these. And even we are seeing that yuan is, they are talking about yuan replacing dollar and yuan as a reserve currency at some point of time, or and making a lot of advancements in blockchain, cryptocurrency, etc. So how do you see some of these developments? Thanks very much.
Is it directed to anyone in particular, or anyone can answer?
Well, anyone, yeah, thanks very much.
I do legal and political risk advisory for companies. I had a demo question open to everybody that, that is the co-leader, the Chinese successive leadership, is it more, cyclical and state orchestrated, in the sense like when, originally came, I think, Mao, and then Mao after that came Deng. They were, hardline in nature, but Deng opening up post-Mao. Then after that, we saw a period between Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, which was further opening up and liberalization and less authoritarian. Then it went back to Xi Jinping, which is completely authoritarian. So is it a state orchestrated thing where you have plus and minus, authoritarian leadership, and then it starts opening up, then the same thing happens again? Is it a cycle in that? Like post now that you've had Xi Jinping, is somebody else going to be a slightly lesser version of him, and then, open up completely, and then we go through the cycle again? So that's a general question.
So let us take these three questions. Aravind, why don't you go with this question?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there is nothing like anti-incumbency in China. Like, somebody decides and come, okay, this is not Tamil Nadu, AIDMK ho gaya and DMK aa gaya. This is not. It's just because the way factionalism play the role. Because what happens is all the transitions, you say that Deng Xiaoping came, but Deng Xiaoping was purged 3 times. And then he came, right? So Deng Xiaoping fought his way back. When you talk about Jiang Zemin was absolutely coming from Shanghai camp. Shanghai camp is absolutely challenging the other camp in Beijing. Okay, but it was at that time Jiang Zemin was strong. He was having good backup. Actually, he was having support from the other local leaders. That's why Jiang Zemin came. After Jiang Zemin, it was the Young Turks under Hu Jintao, who were moderate, who wanted to have a slow pace, who wanted to have, this is what I use a lot of funny terms. In test matches, you have after the fast pacing and into the first fast pacing, you need a medium pace bowlers actually. The Hu Jintao was medium pace bowlers. He was there to keep the momentum. He was not to disrupt something. That was quite natural. Xi Jinping is a different product altogether. Xi Jinping was seeing everything. Xi Jinping was sent back to labor camps also. Xi Jinping was seeing his father. Don't forget, when China opened in 1978, his father was the party secretary of the province. He was the one who went and hedged with Deng Xiaoping in Beijing and said, Guangdong, open it. Guangdong, open it. He was yelling and telling them. That's the reason Xi Jinping learned and picked up all these things. And then what Xi Jinping is today is a product, what he learned from Mao, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and then he created it on his own. Second term, he changed the ball game altogether. He became more fanatic as far as, because he thought that he's running short of time and he has to do it. What happens next is quite interesting. But what I can predict is actually then I can predict my personal opinion here. I'm not subscribing to anybody's thing. Would be equally revolutionary, equally rebellious, but not as fanatic as Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping is going to stay there for another 10 to 15 years. He would not really allow somebody equally vocal, rebellious, and revolutionary. He would be wanting somebody who is playing auxiliary role, something like that. What Putin allows Medvedev to do it. Same thing is going to happen in China. So nothing is rule set over there that there has to be a leadership of high tempo, low tempo. Is nothing like that. So it's absolutely unnecessary to say that there is anything trend set in that way.
Gaurie, why don't you take the question about
RCEP and oil
many
price.
things, yes.
Yeah, three things, yes. Okay, first is the oil price. Chinese economy is going through a deflationary cycle. So they are not going to add on to the oil price spike globally. In fact, they'll be the beneficiary if at all oil prices go down. That's the first answer. Second, you mentioned about RCEP. So you're right about the fact that RCEP was envisioned as this big trade pact to ensure that Chinese goods can find newer markets. In the backdrop of the Chinese economy having a 2% trade surplus, which indicates a very poor domestic demand, this tendency to flood markets with cheaper products will only increase. So some of these countries will see more of cheaper Chinese goods coming in the next couple of quarters, till the time there is some revival of domestic demand. And the third part you mentioned about the Asian Infrastructure Bank that China has. The problem with this kind of lending or Chinese lending is that they are not part of the Paris Club, which means that if there is any country which fails, there is no rescue ship that is available. Unlike what some of the other countries offer, they are all members of the Paris Club, which means that if any country defaults, multilateral arrangements are in place to ensure that there is not a sovereign default. That isn't the case with Chinese lending because it's not a member of the Paris Club, and no amount of coercion can bring China into the Paris Club, because that will mean its loans will become transparent and cannot be as atrocious as I mentioned, 6.2 interest kind of a thing. But there's no way around that. Right now, countries that subscribe to it have to take up the kind of very uneven and unfavorable terms that China offers.
See, there was in between, after Deng Xiaoping time, there was a debate about the provincial liberalization. So which means that there was a lot of autonomy, as I was saying, given to the provincial cities and municipalities, etc., to raise revenues, income generation projects, infrastructure development. But, and there was a time where a lot of this fiscal income was given to the central government as well. The ratio was 60-40. So whatever you have budgetary income, 60% you go to the central government and 40% you leave it among yourself. But gradually, what is happening now, as everybody is talking about Xi Jinping's becoming authoritarian regime, centralized government. Now there's so much of even the appointment of provincial party secretary. Who appoints that? It is basically the Communist Party at the central level. So there is a lot of this bargaining takes place there. So who will be, and loyalty actually goes along with, I mean, who is corrupt, who is not corrupt, we don't know. Most of the things is all being, the way it has come to the public media, it has been like Communist Party itself is a kind of a deciding who is corrupt and who is not. So basically they have certain criteria to judge the loyalty as well as the corruption, which is purely at the political perspective. So that's where you will see the power is concentrating in the hands of the central government Politburo Standing Committee members.
Good evening to all. I am Ankit. I am first year PhD student. I am PhD student in Chinese study in JNU. I have a question to Aravind Yelery sir. Actually, two questions, sir.
Don't get to ask him in JNU.
Since the topic is on Chinese economy, so we can talk. So, in the book Barry Nongton, he has written that Chinese economy adaptation and growth in 2018. He has talked about as we seen the pattern of miracle growth like in East Asia, like Japan had a miracle growth in 1960, and in 1972 oil crisis, this whole GDP growth plummeted, and after that we have seen the lost decade of Japan and all that. After that we have Korean high growth of 90s, and that was stopped by 1997 Asian financial crisis. So are you seeing a pattern like this 3 decade or 4 decade of Chinese fast economic growth has been plummeted by the COVID? I mean, are you seeing an external variable? Second question is, sir, since you are saying of course China is like growing 5.6 per year, so but since China has has an economy of like 17-18 trillion, so as the base become larger, as the pie become bigger, it's very difficult to to have a like 9 digit or 8 digit growth per year. So don't I mean, as a researcher, don't you think we are becoming a little bit too pessimist for China? I mean, we should have a a growth. I mean, a benefit of, we can give a benefit of doubt to Chinese economy.
Taking off from what he has just said, we've been China watchers. For the last 20 years, I've heard that their growth is unsustainable. There was a seminar in 2006. I was doing the high command course in Army War College. 2-day seminar. We had a number of experts, including academics, who came over to Mao, and they told us they have a water crisis, they have an energy crisis, they can't sustain, they have fault lines, they're going to collapse, they're going to, just splinter. So while we are looking at all this, but I think we should watch it very carefully, but at the same time not overstate their problems and find what solutions they are having. But what matters to us, their intention to overtake USA by 2050 remains. I don't know how they'll do it. Their intention to push forward in the global geopolitical sphere continues. They're opening a base in Djibouti. They built a port in Cambodia. They've had a security pact in the Solomon Islands. So we have to watch these things very carefully. We had the last Quad summit, members talking about the Quad summit, when the 4 Quad leaders were sitting in Tokyo, they flew fighter jets around the Japanese ADIZ along with a Russian convoy. So what I'm saying is we need to weigh our options. Ma'am, Gaurie was mentioning about our options and how we're going to look at it. Because while you say technology, they are still behind, but they're catching up very fast with USA. They are even ahead in some spaces. They're hypersonic stuff. Whereas our technology is not going to that same extent. On the other hand, our trade with China has grown ever since the Galwan ban. Since the Galwan crisis, our trade has grown. Yes, the FDI figures have changed. They are growing in certain spheres. We have been able to stop their investments in India to some extent. But do we need to really re-weigh our options a little more closely than just simply saying that, no, they're in trouble. That's not good enough. Thank you.
So my question is directed at both Dr. Yelery and Dr. Agarwal. I am Rishabh. I am a PhD candidate at JNU, and I'm pursuing my PhD in Chinese studies itself. So
none of you JNU guys come for other events. Only when your professors are on the panel you come, which is not fair.
So we are here always. We always come.
Go ahead.
So a comment was made on systemic issues. And my question is related to and this is a general sort of question that is being asked as well. Questions regarding data collection with regard to what is the state of the economy in general. And so this is a question that has been raised again and again, that because there are local as well as provincial incentives in such a manner that the local authorities are sort of incentivized in such a manner that they want to project more success than has actually been achieved. And this kind of misinforms the central authorities as well. Now, given the state of economy right now, do you see, both ma'am and sir, do you see a situation where the central authority is going in a direction where it wants to at least have better data collection, if not for the rest of the world, then for itself? Are there indicators around that? And one more question regarding ghost towns. Ma'am, one of the things that has happened is at least that infamous city in Inner Mongolia, the Ordos city, that has been now projected as like now sort of being occupied. Like it was completely empty. It was an entirely built up city with monuments and everything, skyscrapers, and practically empty, like 10% or so. Now they're saying it's like, I mean, around 50% population sort of moved into the city as per the planned, projection of the occupancy of the city. So that is, I mean, a bit of a contradiction. I would like you to expand on that a bit more. Like exactly what is happening with the overreach of the infrastructure being built, at least with regard to city-based infrastructure in China. Thank you.
Hello to everyone. I'm again from JNU. So my question is to Gaurie ma'am, particularly since she mentioned about the CPEC and China, Pakistan's power grids. So my question is that isn't it a sort of an exaggeration or so to say, to blame a country's non-performing of its economy on another country?
The title, economic uncertainty. That is why we were trying to bring the uncertainties in a short period of time. But you're right, it's not judgmental. I mean, we're not concluding that China is going to collapse or China is going to. But the thing is that even I would say, Aravind is saying he went to China in 2007. I went to China in 1997. First time to learn Chinese language. And that was a China where, it was people only used to ride cycle, very few cars. And the Chinese, which actually so much of boasting of saying, that India is now what we were 20 years back. But that was a time where you will see that, people don't have any manners. I mean, all kind of things, and very short, very small houses and very less wages. Then you go to 2002 and then suddenly you see a big boom, economically developed and all this. So we have also seen China prospering through our eyes. And now it's very, painful to see that China is into crisis because, we have seen that prosperity happening, and you used to be, as I'm saying that, 97, 2002, and then over the years you will see people have, flourishing. They're prosperous, they have a lot of money, and they can, roam around. And for them, money was not a big problem, looked like. But now the time has come, maybe because of the external pressures, as well as because as it is, there's a kind of a recession, all throughout. That has affected Chinese economy, and that is a phase. So, but it is full of challenges, where China has to think of some alternative model. I mean, those kind of a model of just investment infrastructure and think of a revenue generation and land sale may not work, so to say. And why the provincial leaders were actually trying to build it on that, as you were saying, it is basically performance-based. So if you do bring in so much of infrastructure development, revenue generation, you will get promotion. So promotion became one of the criteria to perform well, especially in the localities. And if you don't perform well, then nobody wants to remain static in their career. So that was one motivation. Ghost towns are there in all the cities, not simply in the far off places, etc. The ghost towns, what I mean to say, one where, of course, no occupancy. Second thing is that where the real estate developers are not able to complete the projects. So in India also we have now various cases where people are not able to, and then the whole thing is that people are adamant that they want to enter into this area because they have given so much of money. So there were a lot of news items which I was reading where they are entering into the half-completed housing projects because they cannot afford to keep paying the interest to both the houses. So I think I leave others to explain.
Okay. Yes, on the Pakistan bit, and I think on the geopolitical aspect also, I'll combine both of them, which is that one is that the Chinese aggression is going to increase. And I think these are tactics that they will probably use going forward even more to deflect some of the realities back home. See, this is not a doomsday scenario that is being painted. Nobody says that. It's an $18 trillion economy growing at 5% is still a very large number. But what we are talking about are the systemic failures that the Chinese economy/society is now witnessing. When Professor Yelery spoke about the unfavorable demographics, nobody can deny that. Probably the numbers are worse than what the Chinese official data seems to suggest, because the provinces do get subsidies depending on the kind of school enrollment numbers they are able to put. So the higher the numbers, the more is the kind of subsidies. So probably those numbers are more inflated than what the realities are. So this is not a doomsday scenario. This is meant to understand that the headwinds that affect the Chinese economy, how do they impact the global economy, and of course impact India. Now, so my sense is that this is probably going to increase further, and spending in two specific areas will increase more. One is the maintenance that they do on their citizens. It is already 7% more than their defense budget. This is probably going to increase even more. It's doubled in the last 10 years. The amount of money they spend in ensuring that their citizens do not come together and congregate and, of course, come out with a rebellion. That will increase, and so will their defense budgets, in line with an effort to deflect attention from some of these grim economic numbers. As far as Pakistan is concerned, the CPEC is a story of terrorism and corruption put together. What is greater is something I think a separate study needs to be commissioned by Pakistan and China to understand what really was the bigger reason. Was it corruption at the Pakistani level, or their undermining the level at which terrorism could get inflicted because of what they were doing to the local population? And it is symptomatic of how BRI has been, which is local resources have been taken, local employment is not guaranteed, local contractors are not participating in BRI. 90% of Chinese contractors participate in BRI, as against multilateral projects where 40% are just of that particular donor country, and remaining 60% are local contractors. Look at the difference. It is bound to create major socio-economic problems, and that is exactly what has happened in CPEC. It has been amplified because of local factors, because of factors pertaining to the region, which is unstable because of a whole host of other regions, which I think we can probably discuss at some other time.
Yes, nice set of questions. I'll take one by one. I'll start in reverse fashion. Rishabh's question about systemic. Who decides system is defaulting? Xi Jinping and leadership? Would they allow a systemic rectification internally? I doubt. Despite having challenges in correcting data collections or data points, I mean, I have two news items in front of me. One is when provinces like Hebei, Henan, and Guizhou were named, and the party secretary were named for statistical violations. This is March 2022, that news. Second news is about the enterprises, the fake enterprises putting or getting into the supplies and productions. So that is already taking place in China because there was a time from 2007 onwards, after the GFC, Chinese have been taking things quite seriously, formulating regulations, introducing tax, not implementing them. It's a different thing. But Chinese have been taking things quite seriously as far as data, standardizations of laws and regulations are concerned. It's a different thing that in the Chinese themselves. Now, if you look at the numbers of people who are defaulting on the tax returns, are the high net worth rich Chinese, these things. And those are the people who are not even falling in line as far as tax returns and paying taxes are concerned. So if system decides, I'm not going to follow, are you going to question system that, hey, look, that's a problem, okay? That's one thing we need to understand in terms of China. With regard to the question of are we too pessimistic, we are not too pessimistic. When China was growing 14%, we were still sad. When China was growing at 78%, we were still sad. We were still apprehensive. So it is quite natural when China is growing at 5%, let's be apprehensive. So it is being maintained in the line and length of our thinking of China. China is unpredictable. What Lowell Ditmer said about China, China is after 45 years opening, China is still undergoing through multiple personality disorder. Everybody has to take that point with a pinch of salt. Strong China is a problem strategically. Weak China is a problem because you remember, you're talking about Evergrande. What happened to Evergrande? Quarter of the economy has been churned out of this sector, right? 70% of Chinese households are into the housings. Realty sector. When they stop That means that they're not going to buy steel, they're not going to buy cement, they are not into anything of capital products globally. That means that that is a problem for the entire world. This is a very essential thing. Every one of us must know that, whether or not China is growing or stopping, we have to keep all these facets and dimensions in our mind and understand why it happened. And there is a point I always tell, when it comes to India and China, we don't need to copy from China. We need to learn mistakes China made. We should not imitate. We should imitate the way they circumvented the challenges. That's the learning lessons which we have. And that's the reason we are sitting here. And that was my point to make. About COVID is another jinx point or a breaking point. I don't think so, because from 2007 onwards, everybody of us saw that China is slowing down. COVID happened. And if you look at after COVID, the way Chinese economy came back roaring, we thought that it will keep the momentum. Forget about last year, first year, Q1 2023. Look at the figures, promising figures. And now, a very journalistic statement. Is it 2% bad or 4% is bad? We are not, because economists are never correct. They were never correct in 1929. They were never correct in 1972. 1997, 2007. So I will not take a role of economist over here. What I mean is that 5% growth, fine for China. They have to get rid of contradictions. When I made the first intervention, when we began this conversation, I said there are ways out the central government can look into, take the local debt on their balance sheet. I mean, if I can make that statement in front of Harsh in ORF, why can't Xi Jinping do it in Beijing, sitting there? Simple thing. This is a conversation every one of us should understand it. We are not pessimistic over here. We are trying to figure out and say, these are the problems out there. Why don't you do it? But who will bell the cat? That's a problem. I'll stop there, Harsh.
So on that note, who will bell the cat? Let me just, the whole point of this discussion was to understand, I think, the trends. And therefore, because I think there's no denying the fact that there is economic uncertainty. There is global economic uncertainty, but I think because China is such an integral part of that global economic order, there is economic uncertainty that emanates from China, that impinges around, and that impacts us. And I think part of the discussion was to have a healthy conversation, more informed conversation on what is going on in China, because a lot of us think we know what is going on, but we really don't. So I think the more such conversations happen, perhaps the more informed our general awareness of China, and I think especially the policy relevant discourse can become. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this. I found this very, very interesting conversation, which I think rarely happens. So thanks to Kalpit for organizing this, and thanks to all my panelists for making time and coming here, and thank you all for being very patient. And we have taken much more of your time than we intended to, but I think we can help you by offering you some tea and coffee, and therefore do some penance. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.